We have with us today Manolo Quezon, or Manuel Quezon III, as he's formerly known, who is a writer, a historian, a political commentator. He writes a regular column in the Inquirer about history and politics and how the two often intersect in our time and in times past. So he's going to do a talk for us today about pandemics and how the Philippines has dealt with pandemics before. We weren't spared from the Spanish flu, as Manolo will tell you, and even before that, if you look at literature from the past, you'll see reports about deaths and epidemics, typhoid and cholera epidemics. In fact, Jose Rizal's sister, one of his sisters, if you remember your history classes at school, had died from cholera, I think. So I'm going to pass you on to Manolo now, and he has a little presentation for us, and then we'll open the floor for questions after that. Thank you so much, Manolo.
Thanks, Bambina. I'm going to ask your indulgence for everyone. First of all, thanks for coming in this afternoon. We're going to be attempting something for the first time, which is to try to talk to you and press the forward button for slides at the same time. And I'll tell you, it was hard enough trying to learn to read from a teleprompter. It's equally hard, apparently, to try to press a button and speak at the same time. So the first thing I'm going to do now is to try to load up my PowerPoint presentation, which involves pressing some buttons. And Bambina, is it okay?
Yeah, perfect.
Fantastic. Now I just have to remember to press the button. Okay, so when Bambina invited me to give this talk, I had some misgivings because do we want to talk about medicine and epidemiology and the scientific aspect of things? In which case I may not be the best guy to do that. Or do we want to take what I like to call the long view and simply look at what happened before and what's happening now, and is there some sort of intersection and interesting comparison that we can make? And after a while, it became clear to me that there might be some interesting things to share with you. And it involves a couple of stories. So let me see, I'm trying to press something here. There. Okay, let's start where we are now, which is the era of COVID-19. We've all been living like hermits for a few months. Everything, and I mean absolutely everything, has been disrupted. Even our very way of communicating and being in touch with each other has radically changed. All our institutions, all the normal interactions that institutions make possible, from travel to communications to commerce, even to traffic, and even the movement of food, has been disrupted. It's not the first time this has happened, but of course it's the first time in the modern era, and it's the first time in living memory. In practically every aspect that we're asked to look at, from governments to our own personal lives, everyone is saying that this is only comparable to World War II, which is almost past living memory for most of us. Imagine then what it means for things like epidemics. We've had scares in the past, and we'll be talking about that today, but nothing really has hit home in this manner. And if it has, within living memory, we are remarkably able as a species, as people, and not just as Filipinos, to quickly forget about the things we've been through. So I just want to center all of us on some of the things we're going to be visiting, sort of the themes for our talk this afternoon. How strange and mysterious an epidemic is. How it appears and often catches everyone, including those who are supposed to be in charge, off balance. How it disrupts things in expected ways. I mean, people die, and unexpected ways. Governments rise and fall. Revolutions take place. Old beliefs give way to new ones. All of these things are being experienced by us today and were experienced by our ancestors in the past. And we're going to see some of these things and how it connects to the experiences of other people in other places. So there's going to be two main divisions to my talk to you this afternoon. The first half is what I would like to call the great fears. And I'll go into why that is in a while. It's really two big chunks of time from 1521 to 1883, the era of conquest and pestilence, and from 1883 to 1903, a time that has been called one of agents of apocalypse. And as you see from the illustration there, if you can see the tiny image there, a lot of Mexico is going to enter our discussion. The second half of our talk this afternoon, I called Fitness and Pandemics, and it's two shorter periods of time and much closer to us than the first half of our talk. It's from 1918 to 1946, in a time when we were contracting colonialism as if it was a kind of disease in itself. And from 1946, when we became an independent country, to today, um, outbreaks and their impact on us. A lot of it has to do with something that separates this modern era with what came before, which is something that's in this cartoon from 1900, which is the idea of germs and how to deal with germs. So let's get started. Let's look at the great fears. I've subtitled it Phantom Epidemics because there's a lot going on in a very long period of time, hardly any of which has any sort of impact or detectable sort of memory in us as a people. All of these things were happening, but it seems that we have no sort of collective memory of what this was and why this is so. I started with something I noticed a few years back. This was in 2009, so what, 11 years ago, and it involved something that happened in Mexico City, and in fact, in the cathedral of Mexico City. If you remember your basic history, we were ruled from Mexico for about 300 years. I mean, it was really through Mexico that Spain governed us. Now, in 2009, um, there was H1N1, if you remember, this was a bird flu. And what happened when that started to become a public health concern in Mexico was that there's an image of Christ on the cross known as the Lord of Health. And it was removed from a spot where it's on display in the cathedral in Mexico City and carried around in a procession around Mexico City. This is the first time that it had been done since 1850. And it's relevant to us that what happened in 1850, the last time that they brought around in a solemn procession this statue of Christ on the cross, was that there had been a cholera outbreak in Mexico, and there was divine intervention being sought. It's a reminder that we have very sort of ingrained ways of dealing with the unexpected and mysterious. If something unexpected and mysterious happens, then we call on an even more mysterious but greater power to intervene in our favor. If this was happening in Mexico in 2009, in March 2020, the CBCP, the Catholic Bishops' Conference of the Philippines, issued an Oratio Imperata, which is a form of very emphatic prayer that the faithful are encouraged to make as a community, to essentially storm heaven with prayers, asking God to spare the country from the effects of COVID-19. But what we saw was the disruption even of religion, where churches of all denominations were not allowed to open their doors for the period of that we were all confined to our homes to try to stop the passage, the transmittal of COVID-19. It led to the remarkable images that you may remember of the Pope uh, talking to an empty St. Peter's Square and during Easter and that sort of thing. So it's the past and the present combining in many interesting and unusual ways. But again, this brings us to this period in our time. If we're looking at Mexico and what was happening, then this brings up the whole shared experience we have with the Mexicans, which was our long period of being ruled after being conquered by Spain. And I was looking at something that's been sort of bubbling away for anyone interested in history over the past couple of years, since 2019 actually, and it will culminate next year, which is Spain, Mexico, Latin America, the Philippines, so many places are all trying to figure out how do you commemorate something like the voyage of Magellan uh, to try to find a way to Asia, and where, as we know, he got killed along the way here, but his expedition made it back to Spain. Now, why is it that I'm bringing this long sort of anniversary up? If you look at the kind of diary that the man named Antonio Pigafetta kept, um, he was a member of the expedition of Magellan and chronicled everything that was going on. Magellan died, and he was killed because he got in the middle of a fight between two chieftains. This is sort of the Reader's Digest condensed version of this. I want to zero in one fact that Pigafetta chronicled and is often overlooked because we're used to the paintings of brave datus on the beach with, you know, with their swords and fighting mano a mano with the Spaniards. What Pigafetta chronicled was that Lapu-Lapu was clever enough to notice that for all the armor that the Spaniards were wearing, their calves, you know, the lower part of their legs were left exposed, and he told his people to aim their arrows at their legs, and that's what struck down um, uh, Magellan and led to his being slain on the beach. But here's the thing. If we could do it, if the Cebuanos at that time could do it, why did the Spaniards then later on succeed? And it makes you realize that, hold on a minute, how did they even succeed in earlier places like Mexico? There were always far fewer than the people they were facing. Now, this is something that also will bring us to later on. Why is it that, for example, someone like Magellan failed, and why is it that someone like Legazpi, who came about 50 years later, why did he succeed? What are the elements that made all of these conquests possible? Which brings us back to Mexico. Let's look at the first sort of encounter that would later on sort of become the prototype for all the subsequent encounters. The arrival of the Spaniards in Mexico, which had a developed empire and all of that. What made them able to take over a huge, highly developed and very prestigious empire that was full of riches? Well, some of you may have encountered this book. It's been very popular. It makes for great reading. And it really boils down into three aspects why a small group of unwashed Europeans can take over huge empires. And it's a combination of guns, germs, and steel. And I want to focus on this part on the germs part. Now, aside from Jared Diamond and his book and his looking at this sort of combination of things that made, you know, the collapse of great civilizations possible, there are scientists from the global south that have looked at this. There's a Mexican epidemiologist, so this is a guy who studies epidemics, named Rodolfo Acuña Soto, and he was looking at the past. And he was looking at how Hernando Cortes, who was the conquistador who arrived in Mexico with less than 1,000 men in 1519, was able to destroy an empire. He says that this was the beginning of something that he calls mega death, which sounds really scary. And the statistics will bear out what he's talking about. Uh, in 1519, when Cortes arrived with his less than 1,000 conquistadors in Mexico, there was a population of 22 million. By the end of that century, 80 years later, by 1599, the population had gone down to 2 million. And it's not that, 1,000 Mexicans who were essentially immune to any armaments of the Mexicans then. I mean, because they were essentially a Stone Age culture, so they had no steel. But it was germs that really wiped out and weakened the ability of these empires to resist. The populations, for example, in the Americas at that point had no immunity to smallpox, to measles, or to mumps. And just those diseases alone killed thousands, then tens of thousands, even hundreds of thousands, and eventually millions in the Americas, with a combination of things happening at the same time. The diseases, no one knew what they were, and so it seemed like some sort of curse coming down on the populations because the invaders were immune. Um, and it seemed to affect anyone high or low, mighty or powerless, and it affected lots of people, and there was no cure. And as a result, everything started falling apart. The power of government, the ability of the military, all communications, and then even the morale of populations. So this is what was happening in Latin America. Now, this brings us to an interesting question. Was that what happened here? For the longest time, until this lady named Linda Newson came along, and she has a book whose title you can see there. It says Conquest and Pestilence in the early Spanish Philippines. Until Linda Newson came along, there had been sort of a basic rule of thumb among, or a sort of a shared belief among historians. They said that because the Philippines is near China and Asia, other Asian countries, there was so much trade and so much travel and interpersonal contact going on that, unlike, let's say, Central and Southern and South America and the Americas in general, which were really separated by enormous oceans and thus had huge populations that had never experienced diseases like smallpox, places like the Philippines and our neighbors in Asia had been exposed to all of these diseases. And so there's one big difference between the way our populations related or encountered the West with that of the Americas, in which is that we didn't all start dying of diseases as soon as the Westerners came. But Linda Newson decided to challenge this belief. And she actually started going back to the old accounts. And essentially what she discovered was, well, okay, maybe that you didn't have the big dying off in the same way that you had in South America. But she says if you look at the accounts of all the little places, you will see that there was an impact, that there would be the arrival of the Spaniards, and they were bringing germs and diseases that the Filipinos in that particular area had never encountered before. Now, it's often overlooked, and historians didn't factor it in because of one thing. Unlike, let's say, the Americas, where you had large, well-developed sort of empires, we had very small, isolated communities scattered all over the place. And if you go through her book, it's something like this. There'll be a little village, the Spaniards will arrive, people will get sick and die, but it's so small that you have to sort of really read between the lines to figure this out. And because the populations are small, the Spaniards will leave, the population will bounce back, and it goes into a cycle. But there was also another difference in the Americas when the germs from the Westerners arrived. There was a huge sort of dying off, but then once it had sort of burned through the population, measles, mumps, and all of these things, the population started to bounce back. Linda Newson says that if you look at the Philippines, the bouncing back was much slower. And that accounts for something that you will find until actually the beginning of the 20th century in the Philippines, which is that there are large areas of the country which were very underpopulated or hardly populated. I've even read accounts from the 1930s about how for people traveling past Mindoro, many large areas of Mindoro didn't even have people, according to the observers in the 1930s. And this is something we in our present day, where we're all crammed in and there's so many people, can't imagine, because this has been an explosion of population since the post-war years. But anyway, so here's one basic thing. You don't need, let's say, a strange disease like COVID. You can only have just sort of, in many ways, commonplace diseases. But when they arrive in populations that are unused to them and have no immunity to them, the effect can be catastrophic. And the catastrophic effect includes answering the question, how can a few people march around entire areas and take over everything and be accepted? Now, one of the things that I like to focus on is something that then connects, explaining why it is that Filipinos sort of were conquerable just as the way other people were. And some diseases that can sort of become our companion over the rest of our story for today. One of these diseases is something that's basically considered extinct in the world for all intents and purposes, but until very recently and until well within living memory, was a feared disease, and that's something called smallpox, called bulutong. Now, it's not until 1574, which is around the time of Legazpi's expedition, that we start having records of smallpox outbreaks in the Philippines. But if you look at the official history of the Department of Health, for example, you have repeated cases of cholera epidemics and people's dying in the tens of thousands at a time when our population was very small. And how they would come here. For example, in 1789, as the Department of Health tells us, it was a vessel from China traveling to the Ilocos, which brought an epidemic of cholera, which soon spread to Manila and neighboring provinces, leading to great die-offs, especially because people didn't understand how these things were spread, the importance of washing hands or sanitation or anything like that. Pasteurization hadn't even been invented. So there would be exposure because of our being a place that is a crossroads for trade and travel. And then it would spread over networks among people who weren't very familiar with the importance of hygiene. Now, this brings you to what an amazing thing the first sort of advances in science must have been like. If you go to Intramuros, you'll see this statue. I hope you can see it. It's a statue right in front of the Manila Cathedral. It's of Carlos the Fourth, the King of Spain. And it recounts, and the statue was put up as a thank you by Manila for his sending a cholera vaccine in 1802. Which was sort of like, an amazing thing, because this had been a formerly unbeatable disease, one that just mysteriously erupted. And yet all of a sudden from Spain came this miracle way of, making little cuts in people and putting a little serum there, and then you would build an immunity to the disease. And part of it, of course, is shown by this map, which is from the DOH. I don't know if you can see it very clearly, but I hope you can sort of trace that green line, um, which shows you the path of the Balmis expedition, which had to bring that smallpox vaccine to the Philippines. Sorry, not in 1802, but in 1805. How it had to travel around the world in a very slow manner to just bring some sort of hope for disease. Now, remember this. Remember that the only way to address it was to bring a vaccine that had to be imported from Spain, and how doing that in 1805 led to the building of an expensive statue that still exists. And it's going to come back um, as a reminder of what's going to happen next. Now, this is what happens next, which is the second part of our first part. There's this interesting book with this really spooky title called Agents of Apocalypse, which is about epidemic disease in the colonial Philippines by a fellow named Ken de Beauvois. And he says something that few of us knows. Between 1883 and 1903, he said the Philippines had the world's highest morbidity, which means people were dying of diseases at the biggest rate compared to anywhere in the world. And this is a very interesting piece of information. Look at the dates that we're looking at, 1883 to 1903. There are 3 events that take place within these years that one of them we're going to be commemorating on Friday, which is our Independence Day on June 12th. We had the first outbreak of the Philippine Revolution in 1896. We had the second outbreak of the Philippine Revolution in 1898, which gave us our flag and anthem. And then we had the Philippine-American War, in which the Americans came and replaced Spain. These were really traumatic incidents for our country, experiences. And there is a case to be made that the reason why is it that of all times it was in 1896 and not in 1886 or 1876 that everything came together so that the Filipinos finally dared to launch a nationwide revolt against Spain. One argument made by this book and others that have taken a cue from it is there was a great crisis of public health. That among the many things going on as the Spanish Empire sort of went into senile decay in our part of the world was public health fell apart to the extent that it became like an apocalypse to that generation. In which case, in apocalyptic times, nothing is unthinkable. You can think of toppling the Catholic Church. You can think of creating a new government. You can think of a country that is not ruled by white people in such a time, because everything seems to be falling apart, so you may have nothing to lose. So what are the things that were coming together and coming to a head so that we here in the Philippines were setting world records for the number of people dying from these things? One was smallpox, our old friend smallpox. And he labeled it because of a failure of the healthcare system. What failures, for example? There were times when the serum or the vaccine from Spain just wouldn't arrive from Spain, and we had no way of making it. There are other times when Manila, of course, then as now, nothing moved in the country unless Manila said so. Manila wouldn't want to bother Madrid with an order for smallpox vaccine. And so the provinces were up in arms demanding that something be done because people were dropping dead. from smallpox, or they were dropping dead from cholera. And again, it was the same systemic problem. You would have cholera vaccines available, but then um, they were not being sent from Spain. And then people felt neglected, they felt sore, they felt abandoned, they felt angry. There were things happening so that, for example, if you remember your Rizal course, you know, you remember the humiliations of the Rizal family because they were in Calamba and they were farming land that belonged to the Dominicans, and then they were humiliated. Well, all of this is called cash cropping, that you're growing crops, whether it's coffee or sugar or rice, on a greater sort of nearly industrial scale, not as owners of the land, but as tenants of the land. And part of this is that people are eating much less well because they're not just growing for their own needs, but they have to grow fundamentally first to please the landlord, who could be a religious order. And so you start having vitamin deficiencies, and one of the effects of kinds of vitamin deficiencies for vitamin B1, B2, for example, would be beriberi. And so there's epidemics of beriberi happening during this period at the tail end of the Spanish era. You're having things like malaria, where Manila is no longer able to fit in Intramuros, which, by the way, is a medieval city surrounded by moats, which are the perfect breeding ground for mosquitoes. And so you have the very rich and wealthy and powerful Spanish priests all holed up in their convents in Intramuros, but getting sick and dying because they keep getting malaria from the mosquitoes. And it's having an effect on the environment. You have places like Malate and Ermita, which are growing outside uh, the center, the old heart of Manila, because those are places that are far healthier, less liable to have malaria. And because of this, they're also further physically from the domination and the control and of the authorities. And so people are able to talk more and plot more and do things. So they can do things in Tondo, such as set up the Katipunan. And then, of course, our old friend cholera, where um, there are just waves and waves of cholera epidemics coming out of China, coming out of India. Because we are a trading country, ships are coming not just to Manila anymore, but they're going to Iloilo and to other ports. There are more and more ways to bring in diseases and faster ways for them to spread, because also at this time, we have things like the railroad being introduced to the Philippines. And so a disease can spread much faster than simply on horseback. And according to the Bevas, all of these things were coming to a head um, with other things that other historians have mentioned, which is that one cause, for example, for the Philippine Revolution is because communications were faster and because the Spaniards had lost their Latin American empire, they actually could focus more attention on the Philippines and actually started to do something dangerous, which was try to make government more efficient. Here's one non-medical and non-epidemic related effect of this, which was for centuries, leading families throughout the country had become mayors and councilors in all of the towns and cities of the country. And it was their job, which was almost hereditary, although there were elections which allowed power to shift from one family to another. All of these families had the job of collecting taxes for the Spanish government. Well, one of the reforms of Spain was that, look, if you are a gobernadorcillo and you're not collecting enough taxes based on our records, you're going to have to make up the difference of what's expected from your own pocket. And all of a sudden, people belonging to families who had been like this for centuries with the friar and with the captain general suddenly thought that independence might be a very good idea because they couldn't skim money anymore from the treasury. So all of this is coming together and leads to the whole title for this first half of our talk, which is there can be other epidemics besides germs that are having great effects. For example, fear. You can have great fears. The term great fears from an article by a person named John Markov in the book you're seeing here, The Rise and Fall of the French Revolution, which was essentially his term for a paranoia that happened in France during the time of Marie Antoinette and Louis XVI. There was a problem um, at the time that the French Revolution happened, which was this. There was a little ice age in Europe. And because there was a little ice age, all of a sudden crops failed. And when crops failed, people got hungry. And when people got hungry, they got angry. And there was a rumor, and then many rumors that began in France that said that because there was a shortage in grain, um, and that people were going hungry in the cities, that the king or his army or bandits or even merchants were going to go down and go to the farmers and force them to give up the little grain that had still survived the little ice age. And because of this, the farmers started getting together and forming militias. Because the farmers were forming militias, the government started panicking. And because the government started panicking, it started cracking down. And because it started cracking down, even the middle class and the upper classes, which were very worried about the situation, suddenly found that any sort of reform and debate was impossible. And therefore, you had the whole basis for a revolution. So if you have great fears like this, and you're looking at the effects of diseases and epidemics that keep on coming and keep on not being addressed by the authorities in the Philippines, you have things that will filter through even into novels. And here, fiction is what gave me the insight that I've carried for about 20 years since I first encountered this. There's a novel by the late Chitang Nakpil called The Rice Conspiracy. And there's this little passage in it where she has a Russian talking to a Filipino. And the basic uh, result of this discussion was that, you know, even if hunger played a role in the Russian Revolution of 1917, it also played a role in the Philippine Revolution of 1896. It's because Filipinos had been enduring oppression for hundreds of years, but there was a big failure of the crops. People were hungry, and it's at that point that everything came to a head in 1896, and that's what forced the Katipuneros to revolt. That was just Chitang Nakpil inserting something into a novel. But as we've seen, there was a basis for this sort of apocalyptic point of view. And if you look at there's this a Frenchman named André Belesort who spent just 1 week in the Philippines in November 1897. But he wrote this beautiful, beautiful, really amazing passage that's something out of Gabriel Garcia Marquez. He says that when he was traveling around Manila, he just heard the weirdest things. That in Tondo, that there was a rumor that around 6 in the evening, people would see the apparition of a woman whose head was crowned by serpents. Um, and everyone understood this to mean that something terrible was going to happen. There's another rumor that in Biak na Bato, a woman had given birth to a child who emerged fully dressed in a general's uniform. And you have to sort of step back to your history to remember that in 1897, in Biak na Bato, there was a new government established by Emilio Aguinaldo, general. And so that's why people were trying to connect what was going on with these weird and spooky things. Um, and the point of this Frenchman, and of course, you know, the Frenchmen are geniuses at making these observations. He said, you know, for centuries, the Filipinos had had their imagination sort of oppressed. You couldn't imagine anything because anything you imagined was probably heretical. And so all of a sudden, when all the old authorities were melting away, people were just giving vent to this new era of change with strange visions and strange rumors and strange ideas that in many ways um, we would call them sort of psychosomatic today, right? They're the a reflection in the mind of what we're experiencing in the body, whether it's hunger or fear or unease. So at the tail end of this period, where apparently the Philippines was one of the worst places for epidemic diseases ever at that time, we then encountered the third trauma um, in within one decade, which is after the first phase of the Philippine Revolution, the second phase, we now engage in a full-blown war for our national survival with the Americans. And we lose. And part of that is the compounding of the effects of war, which is more epidemics and more diseases because whole populations are having to run for their lives, are living in the hills, are unable to eat, are in many cases deliberately starved to defeat them. And it will lead to, as the victory of the Americans, and they're trying to recreate the Philippines in their image. And one of the first things they do, for example, is if you go to Intramuros today, the same Intramuros that had been surrounded by moats that were breeding grounds of malaria that made even life hell for even the Spaniards. One of the first things they did, the Americans did, was to cover over all of the moats to stop the spread of malaria. And instead of moats, they built a golf course, which is still a golf course today. Um, and this is just one sign of how things are going to change with the introduction of something the Spaniards had sort of kind of tried, but now the Americans were really, really going to focus on, which is the elimination of diseases uh, and changing the way we all behave. Which brings us to the second part of our exploration today. So we're going to be meeting things like the Spanish flu, and then we're going to be ending with COVID-19. And I chose as a title of this Fitness and Pandemics because there are many ways we react to disease. We react to it psychologically. So there's mental fitness, there is physical fitness, whether we're able to face it. And of course, there's also the health of the body of us, a society, and what happens when pandemics come and influence us. Now, we're going to be meeting something called the Spanish flu, which is called the Spanish flu because it was emerging all over Europe at this point. The most recent scholarship suggests that, guess what? It had started in China and had traveled through shipping and other forms to Europe, which was experiencing the tail end of World War II, which had, of course, disrupted large populations. People were hungry, people were easily susceptible. Anyway, it's in Spain, however, that there's no censorship because they're not part of the war. And so the papers are free to report what they like, and it becomes newsworthy because there's this strange new flu that emerges, and the king of Spain himself, Alfonso XIII, this rather peculiar looking man you see on your screen, who incidentally was the last Spanish king over the Philippines, he caught it, and therefore it became big news. And then people started connecting the dots and seeing everything that there was a global pandemic taking place. So you have this Spanish flu, and as the World Health Organization tells us, it became the first of three great pandemics during the 20th century. There was the Spanish flu in 1918. There was Asian influenza in 1957, and some of you watching now may have some of your earliest memories be of this. There was the Hong Kong influenza in 1968. But the mother of all outbreaks was the 1918 Spanish flu. And we're going to look at this and try to connect it with the American era and things going on. Essentially, what the information of the data of the scientists tell us is that As the flu emerges every few years, it will mutate, and each mutation suddenly hits the world population, which has no resistance to it. And over time, there can be big or small sort of reactions in terms of fatalities. You're familiar with this. Um, it's just a basic concept we have to be familiar with. Now, all of this it involves, the idea of germs, of viruses, that we can be affected with them. And the Americans were really obsessed about this. You have this editorial cartoon from 1900, and it's very telling that you have President McKinley here with the Americans didn't know, were we black or brown or something in between, and so we're portrayed as sort of like as little African children. And it's um, relevant here that the first thing that they're trying to portray as their task is to clean us up, literally, um, to bring us out of dirt and disease and into the modern world. And I wrote about this in back in 1995, and it's really something that the Americans were very proud of. And actually, for that generation of Filipinos, was pretty amazing for them to encounter. That things like cholera, amoebic dysentery, dengue, malaria, cholera, and smallpox all of a sudden became things that weren't mysterious and could be addressed. That there could be a way to fight against this. And that the Americans poured a lot of resources and ingenuity into doing this. For example, tiki tiki, which you're familiar with for berry, is starts being developed as an extract of rice bran in the American era here. The Americans were bringing in soy milk to try to come up with a cleaner, nutritious way to feed babies. There's the idea of canning things, including milk, which is why even until the 1970s or 80s, people would sometimes be raised on canned milk because it was considered hygienic. And there were even cases of not just fighting human diseases, but animal diseases. No one today knows or has heard of something called rinderpest. But for 30 years, much of the energy of Philippine scientists and the first generation of Filipino veterinarians um, was to fight this disease that was killing in livestock, which had to be imported in big numbers because guess what? All our livestock had practically been wiped out during the Philippine Revolution and the Philippine-American War. And then we brought in livestock and it brought in diseases with it, and then it became a big problem. So many of the things that you sort of just take for granted today, whether it's something like Bear Brand, um, and the idea that you could have clean milk when people would die of cholera from drinking milk, or things that beriberi seems like a very old-fashioned disease, and yet up to today on TV you'll see things like tiki tiki being advertised. All of this is part of a new era and a new sort of idea that you can fight and prevail over disease. And yet, the old reliables still kept on coming. One example, cholera in 1902 to 1905. That's 3 years. Um, there was an epidemic and it claimed 200,000 lives at that point. Remember, this is about a period when the entire population of the Philippines was about 8 million or so. 66,000, it considered the worst epidemic in all our history, and up to now, it's considered part of it. Earlier, you heard Bambina mention that one of Rizal's sisters died of cholera. Well, Apolinario Mabini was another person who died in this great cholera epidemic because he drank tainted Carabao's milk, because we hadn't made pasteurization a part of everyday life. Now, a guy named Warwick Anderson wrote and studied about this whole thing about germs and the Americans and Filipinos, and how the Americans and Filipinos viewed each other through the lens of disease and germs. And his book is called Colonial Pathologies. It's a pretty interesting read. Um, And one part of this book is this letter, which is written by, you see, I hope you can see the picture of this fellow on my PowerPoint. His name is Trinidad H. Pardo de Tavera. He was a brilliant fellow, a friend of Rizal. He was the grandfather of Mita Pardo de Tavera, who some of you might remember as the Secretary of Health. He was a doctor. And he wrote very frank letters, including this one to Governor General William Howard Taft of Taft Avenue fame. Um, and let me quote it because I think it boils down in a nutshell the point I want to make about at this point in our story. So Pardo de Tavera wrote, "The people fear the Board of Health a great deal more than they fear the epidemic. The sanitary inspectors, white, brown, black, civil, and military, have committed and still commit all kinds of abuses. Their complaints against the barbarities of the health agents. In Pasig, for example, the provincial treasurer set fire to a house where a victim of the cholera had died, and the flames extended to two neighboring houses, while the provincial inspector went about with a gun on his shoulder in order to intimidate the people, in order to make them obey sanitary laws." Now, what's striking about this letter? Well, you may know how disease is caused. You may have a plan for fighting disease, but you are relying on people to fulfill your plan. And there are sort of ingrained ways and customs um, that sometimes predate you and your plan. What do I mean? Pardo Tavera was complaining that, you know, you're trying to engage in public health, and yet Filipinos and foreigners alike, basically people who have a little power over a lot of people who are not very educated and are not very organized or disciplined from the point of view of the powerful, um, they think that the easiest way to go about it, rather than to try to explain things to people, is to just beat them up, terrorize them, force them, you know, just straight jacket them. And for those of you who are following the news over the past few months, I would argue that in many ways things have not changed. That the Howie boy with the big stick of wood beating people around the head, and the mayor who's saying, go and beat up those people, is a problem in 1903 and a problem in 2020. It's just a limitation of how we view our people themselves. And then, of course, there becomes that wonderful thing, politics. So, for example, in Warwick Anderson's book, he's saying that, you know, look, the Americans claim they're here to improve public health, but, you know, their view is based on a very simple um, assumption. The assumption that the Filipino is by nature a dirty little boy. And because we're dirty little boys, we're somehow inferior. And in many ways, Filipinos may have adopted that point of view, as Pardo de Tavera pointed out, and as we've seen even today. So what happens is that in what's supposed to be the whole case of public health, every time there's an epidemic, it becomes not just a question of health, but a question of politics. More importantly, a question of, is the Filipino even capable of being civilized or running a modern government? So, for example, you know, in 1919, there were American officials who started pointing out, you know, there are a lot of Filipinos dropping like flies, and it shows you we've been there for 19 years and we haven't gotten anywhere. These Filipinos are hopeless. While a Filipino doctor quoted in this article said, well, you know why Filipinos are dropping like flies this year, 1919, it's because last year they all got exposed to the flu and a lot of people are still weak. And so, being weak, they're more liable to drop dead from other diseases because they haven't recovered. And yet it becomes a political football. And over the next 20, 30 years, this period will become ammunition either to prove that Filipinos can do it or that, you know, the Americans know better. Um, In the end, this brings us back to the big pandemic of 1918 for flu, which spread all over the world. How did it affect us? This was the last time a really big pandemic hit us in a way that was really devastating. Well, a fellow named Alfred W. Crosby, who was writing a few years back about what was then America's forgotten pandemic. Now, of course, everyone has gotten a crash course in it. Said that because, since the Philippines was part of the United States at that point as a colony, um, he says that in a population of about 9 to 10.5 million, which is what we had in 1918, their estimate is that about 40% of Filipinos came down with the flu, and that about 70,000 to 90,000 died. So that even in most conservative estimates, you would say that about 2% of those who got the disease died of it, which is pretty high. He says that anecdotally, the stories are even more chilling, that there were in some villages, there weren't enough people who were well enough to bury the dead. So that in some places, perhaps like Cotabato in Mindanao, as much as 95% of the people came down with the deadly influenza of 1918. Now, do we know any more of this? During our being stuck at home because of COVID, a very good Filipino Cebuano journalist named Max Limpag dug up an article that had come up in Philippine studies some years back. And because everyone was suddenly interested in the Great Flu pandemic of 1918, he started looking at what was happening in the Philippines from 1918 to 1919. And he discovered something that simultaneously at this time, um, American media was mentioning that there had been waves of the epidemic. That he says there was Manila and many areas, according to him, was hit by a first wave, but then places like Cebu were hit by a worse second wave, made worse because the flu had mutated by then. So in actual fact, if you look at the actual number of people who had died, there were more people who died in the first wave, but there was a significant second wave anyway that happened just in 1918. Um, so the first wave of the Great Flu Pandemic of 1918 and 19, based on the research of Dr. Francis Gialogo, who wrote in Philippine Studies in 2009, happened from May to June in 1918. It happened in Manila, Bataan, Bulacan, Batangas, Rizal, Laguna, Tayabas, which is now Quezon Province, Pampanga, and Nueva Ecija. So it suggests to us that it came through at least the port of Manila as part of the first wave spreading around the world. And also helps sort of reinforce the idea that it had originated in China. Now, the second wave, he says, then came into regions that were mostly open to global commerce. And that was Cebu, Iloilo, Pangasinan, Negros, and Camarines. And again, and that this shows you that it wasn't even coming from other places in the Philippines, but was reintroduction through sailors and visitors and other people being dispersed in that period. And that we only think that there may be low numbers of people who died in Mindanao and the Cordilleras because there simply wasn't very good data gathering at that point. Now, what this tells us is that it's mainly the flu and its variations, the ability of the flu to mutate, the ability of the flu to be transmitted through other species, that we have become focused in our lifetimes, because the other big diseases of the past, the other great epidemics of the past have become obsolete. You don't have cholera epidemics anymore. Smallpox has been wiped out, the first disease that was wiped out all over the world. Um, you don't have these things bothering people because we have many vaccines and immunity that is both herd immunity and individual immunity. But we have started to face the reality that pandemics can emerge again and again. Earlier, you remember we mentioned that there were two flus that emerged in the 50s and the 60s, many ways forgotten, but that really claimed many lives. Many of you will also remember SARS from 2002 to 2003, which became the sort of the first time many of us will remember as being really worried and freaked out, and which laid the basis, by the way, for how we respond as a country and as a society to this day. Many of the executive orders and regulations that President Arroyo put in place upon the advice of Secretary Manuel of the Secretary of Health at the time were based on protocols and ideas that important things to do is when an epidemic strikes, you have to put health people, experts on top of what's being done, that you have to identify where the disease has gotten it in, who has gotten it, try to isolate it, and therefore keep it from spreading as much as possible. Um, and in many ways, the Philippine record over subsequent governments was pretty good. Um, among 30 countries at the time of SARS, the Philippines turned out to have the lowest rate of infection, and we only had 14 cases at that time, which was viewed as quite an achievement. And even in places like things like animal diseases, we've done pretty well. Back in 2015, we could take pride in the fact that we were free of avian flu from 2005. We were free of foot and mouth disease since 2010. Some of you may remember that if you went to places like Palawan in the 90s and in the early parts of the 2000s, the moment you stepped off the plane, there would be a foot bath that you would have to put your shoes in, and that was one way of fighting foot and mouth. It was effective and it was low tech, but it was something that we managed to do very well. But some things started to fall apart and go wrong. In September 2019, for example, something called African swine fever reached Rizal and Bulacan provinces, where there are many piggeries. And one of the things that has happened during our period of COVID, which you may have not have noticed, is that African swine flu jumped from Luzon to Mindanao back in February of this year. We're a country that has, as I pointed out, had received compliments from around the world in the way we were able to control diseases. And yet somehow we've dropped the ball in recent months. In 2017, when we started worrying about a new version of SARS, which was then being called H5N6, we were worried that it would be coming in and that we would have to face an epidemic from all over, adding to what later on would be problems we face today. It's basically issues that are now very familiar to us. Cross-species contamination, the idea that, it can spread from one kind of animal to humans. And that this is made possible by the ability of the viruses to mutate constantly and over time. And the fact that now more than ever, as we saw as early as the time that cholera and other things were being spread faster through the trains and the railways, imagine now in the era of people traveling by ship in huge ships and by airplane all over the world. There was this really spooky New York Times animated story which traced the spread of COVID-19 from Hunan all over the world in a matter of days. So the thing is, though, over this time, even as we've been repeatedly faced with the emergence of mutations and cross-species contamination and other things like that, the same sort of tried and trusted responses have been refined. I'll give you one case that I'm very familiar with from 2015, the time we were in government. One thing that the government had decided to do at that time to sort of help foster the ease of arrival for tourists and therefore to increase tourism in the country was to abolish the arrival form that people are required to fill out. Well, in that year, MERS-CoV became a big thing. We were suddenly scared because there was one person who arrived um, and was tested positive for it. And then it became very clear to government people talking among themselves that there was very little way of tracing who had been exposed to this person because there's no way of tracking who the fellow passengers were because we had abolished these simple arrival cards. And so all of a sudden the government had to suddenly impose arrival cards being required again. And it brought back to the fore something that, again, we're very familiar with today, which is the importance of contact tracing in getting to clamp down on an epidemic, not when it's already spreading, but just when it started to make its first appearances for us. So, final points that I'd like to make. Remember when we were talking about why it was that diseases and epidemics may have made the Philippine Revolution possible? Well, think of some things that have become part of our news in recent months before COVID came to the Philippines. In 2019, we started to have one of the world's worst measles outbreaks. This is something that had wiped out, as you remember, millions of people in South America in the 1500s. But it's not something that you would be expecting to be breaking out in any place, including the Philippines, in the 2020s. And yet, here it was because people weren't getting their vaccines. Um, because people weren't getting their vaccines, we were having measles, dengue, even polio, that sort of 1950s disease that we weren't worried about anymore, started coming back. And it was declared a health emergency by the United Nations in the Philippines back then in 2019. So all of this is just a reminder to us that however this plays out, and we don't know how COVID-19 is ultimately going to play out in the Philippines, are we going to be hit as badly as other places? Will we ever know that we were hit as badly as other places? However it plays out, there are things we are going through today that are being influenced by what we experienced yesterday. From a purely sort of health point of view, we as a population may be weaker and therefore more liable to getting sick than we were maybe 20 or even 10 years ago, because we're generally more liable to have encountered illnesses that weren't so prevalent because many people are giving up having immunizations. Um, we have tried and sort of tested old ways of handling public health, which is basically clamping down, coming down hard on people without really changing the education and the understanding of the people. The sort of behavior that Pardo de Vera was complaining about at the turn of the 20th century, we're seeing in the 2020s, which was basically just lock everyone up and just hope that it will burn its way through without understanding other elements about, for example, can you really lock everyone up in places where everyone is crammed in because they're poor and things like that? Essentially, though, what the pandemics of the past teaches us in our period of pandemic today is the great stresses and change born of diseases that are hard to understand, having to be attended to by authorities that are trying to learn on the job as the epidemic is happening with tools that may have worked yesterday but may have become obsolete today can lead to stresses. It can lead to um, changes in how we view authority. It can have changes in how we relate to each other. It can suddenly overturn what we used to take for granted. We always used to wait, for example, for instructions from the top. But at a time, let's say, if the instructions aren't coming as fast and as relevant as needed, we now may be looking for answers closer to home. And how is it that for everything from education to religion to politics to media to commerce is being affected and shaken by the epidemic, we may be entering a period of unforeseen changes in our society and in our way of doing things uh, in a way that hasn't been matched since maybe World War II at the earliest, and probably the time of the Philippine Revolution with all that it means. So I hope, um, you know, it will remind us that just as in 1918, that wearing a mask is the best advice possible, that all of us will continue wearing our masks when we leave our homes today. And thank you for spending time with me on this chat today. And I'd be happy to answer your questions if you have any. Thanks. So I will stop sharing my presentation now.
Thank you so much, Manolo, for that. That was like an amazing history lesson through various diseases going back to the 1500s. I was fascinated to learn all that, all the background information you gave about the conquistadores and all that in Mexico and in the Philippines, and how diseases really traveled. And it seems to be, China seems to be the common factor in a lot of these things also. But I'm sure people have a lot of questions. Do you want to type in your questions? If you have any questions, just type it in the chat. Does anyone have questions? Can I just ask Manolo, is there any those previous diseases like smallpox, and what's the basis of that? Is that also animal to human transmission, or is that dirt in the air or some kind of bacteria? Those previous diseases.
Well, I mean, they're viral diseases, and others are born by poor hygiene. So, for example, cholera was a big problem simply because, the transfer of things like milk. They didn't know about pasteurization, and so there were so many ways for the milk to be contaminated as it went from one vendor to another, and they used to be born on little carts. Sometimes the water systems were, of course, um, not very reliable or poorly maintained. Um, so a lot of them are viral. These are viral diseases, sort of in contrast to, let's say, amoebiasis, which is another problem, which is bacterial, but also transmitted in similar ways. Saying this as a non-doctor.
And a doctor. But then it seems to be, why is that kind of militarization that we saw, even by the Bureau of Health?
Yeah, this is the fact that I found most interesting, because if you notice what was happening in recent months, essentially, if you lived in a gated community or in a condo or something like that, the community would police itself, right? But what about other places like Tondo and other places which are essentially large slums? And if you noticed, or if you paid attention to the news, a lot of the sort of official language was very harsh. It was always just sort of, the term pasaway was all over the place. That basically everyone is just sort of um, unreliable and is just going to do everything wrong until you force them and catch them, and then force them to do the right thing. And I thought, well, okay, maybe this is something new because You know, there's just so many of us. We live in some of the most congested communities on the planet. We forget that. But no, you're looking at a place, a time over a century ago, and apparently it's just the way um, officials like to handle things. There's no difference, excuse me, from the way Padre de Tavera was describing people in Pasig from people in Manila 120 years later. It's just, I think it's a combination of how we exercise power as a people, and the only way we feel it can be enforced on uh, ordinary people.
You also said that these diseases or waves of epidemics have been like have sort of like been harbingers for other changes in society. So, what would have been the big change after the Spanish flu? How did it transform society?
Well, if what, for example, colonial pathologies and others suggests is it really led to Filipinos in many ways calling out um, Americans, because look, the Americans had come here and saying we're coming to clean you guys up and teach you sanitation, to wash your hands and not poop everywhere. And the Americans were obsessed with poop. I mean, they thought that, you know, they really just described everything in terms of Filipinos being covered in poop. And by the time of the pandemic in 1918, you already had your first generation of Filipinos um, uh, who were trained in the American universities. You had your first generation of Filipino veterinarians fighting epidemics among animals. You had your first generation of Filipino public health experts. And all of a sudden, the sort of non-scientific racial assumptions of all of this that some American officials are pushing forward starts being called out and being questioned by the Filipinos. It leads to this whole um, very movement that you still find very strong, for example, in places like UP, which has PGH and places like that, to focus on public health, and that Filipinos have the ability to form their own solutions and not always just rely on things from the West. And for maybe 2 or 3 generations, it led to a very high prestige and very high level of competence on the part of public health professionals in the Philippines.
I think corollary to that, we have a question from Lisa. While you correctly pointed out the worrisome similarities between how health crises were mishandled in the past and what seems to be happening now, do you, on the other hand, see any rays of hope?
Yes, I thank you, Lisa, for that. I do see rays of hope, and it boils from the fact that um, there are a couple of trends that maybe you can identify reading between the lines. I mentioned that you know, since SARS and MERS, COVID, and all of that, the Philippines has had a pretty good record. And you know, the people on top may come and go, but the people sort of in the middle and the bottom in our government remain the same, and that includes people in public health. Um, I actually think that, speaking very bluntly here, things would have been a lot worse if we didn't have these people who, regardless of who is in power, regardless of who is setting policy, have a basic level of competence and of getting things done. The weakness of the Philippine government is we're very slow to get things going, but once we get going, we're sort of able to do things, and we've proven that time and again. So, to cut a long story short, Lisa, I think COVID would have been a lot worse if we didn't have this sort of unheralded and unrecognized basic level of competence and cooperation in public health in the Philippines. It probably meant that I can't give you data for this, but this is just a gut feel from having met these people and worked with them in the past, that there were probably a lot more uh, checks made in the airports and seaports and things like that, um, that were never mentioned in the media, that were effective, that there may have been even more, there may have been cases of decent, though not the best, contact tracing, that happened because there's a basic sort of institutional knowledge of this thing. So that's one ray of hope, that one day maybe, just as we're recognizing all the health workers who suffered and died to keep us safe, that there was a lot of quiet sort of basic work done that helped things from getting a lot worse. The second is that we learn fast. Um, we're kind of disorganized at figure things out, and you saw that particularly um, on the local level. That nationally, our hands were tied by a couple of things. Let's say not wanting to offend China in the beginning or whatever. But that mayors faced with the very basic question, can I feed everyone that I've ordered to go into their house? And what are we going to do? Because if these people go hungry, I'm going to be the first one whose city hall is burned before they even march on Malacanang. They had to figure out all sorts of things: logistics, budgeting, distribution, and on the whole, I think there's a lot to be said that it left a lot to be desired, but a lot happened, and we see the basic result. We didn't have massive rioting um, on the country on the way people were very afraid of a few months ago. The private sector stepped up. Basically, when government was trying to figure out what to do, because as I said, it moves really slowly, the private sector, which can move very fast, started doing things that immediately calmed down the situation. What were these things? You remember them. You didn't have to pay your bills right away. They started just rolling out food trucks. Manila House is a perfect example. They started doing a communal kitchen for neighboring communities, and gated communities all over the country started doing that. They started feeding the communities around them. This came again from the basic realization that we have ordered everyone into their homes. The middle class and the upper class may have the resources to survive, but people living hand to mouth day to day did not have any resources, and unless something was done, people were going to die from starvation before you even worry about COVID. So there was that thing. We like to talk about Bayanihan. Well, it worked, and it was obvious, and it delivered in many ways. The other again was this shift from problem solving. Instead of always waiting for the top banana to solve everything, we started demanding results from our barangay chairman. We started demanding results from our mayors. In some places they delivered, in other places they didn't. I'm willing to bet that when all of this is said and done in the next election, people are going to probably vote on that basis. So yes, there was that. It also showed, I think you saw every institution suddenly having to step up creatively to address this. I saw it you're seeing it because I teach in schools now, really trying to talk to each other to figure out ways to do. We can't have a generation of kids who are uneducated for the next year, and people are trying to come up with even in the question of faith. There were innovations and answers being put forward by all the different denominations, again, which helped in many ways make religion much more relevant, even though people couldn't practice the rituals. So I hope that gives answers the question for you, Lisa.
Connected to that as well is another question. So, this is from Doi, what needs to be changed vis-a-vis our culture and perception of diseases to be able to confront the next pandemic should it come, you know, in our lifetime? I mean, hopefully not.
Well, yeah, but Mina, I think in many ways it has been addressed. We're a lot more. Oh, no, we're a lot less ignorant about germs and disease as a society than we were 3 or 4 months ago. Across all levels of society, I'm willing to bet. Um, there are many things to work on. You notice that our OFWs had a hard time going home in many cases because there's still a lot of ignorance out there, and people are afraid. And when there's fear, they will ostracize anyone who comes from outside. In that sense, we're no different from the Chinese. In China, the reaction to COVID was the same. Villages just suddenly set up barricades, um, and even the communist parties found it hard to reassert their authority in the beginning, because these are sort of prehistoric instincts that are coming back. Um, but I think we've seen people being called out. There's a call out culture that I think is healthy. Even health experts were being called out on when they would try to pull rank, or to say, don't question me because I have a degree. Oh no, people felt that they were entitled, because it is a matter of life and death, to ask questions and be informed. Um, Beyond that, it's on those sort of small little evolutionary steps that we may be better off the next time around.
I find at least it might be a good thing that it's the polarization doesn't extend to education or receptiveness to information the way it does probably in the US, where you have Fox News viewers who think that COVID is a hoax and all that. I think here there's a general acceptance of the facts, you know, which is probably a good thing. It works in our favor. So if the information is factual and backed by a doctor or science or medicine, then we're willing to accept it and modify our behavior according to that, right?
Well, I'd point out something which was sort of in the tail end of my talk, but I had to sort of gallop through it, which is we did go through a crisis on medicine and science, um, which was because after the previous government had embarked on a great effort to 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 promote a vaccine, which then started being questioned. There was a big outburst of sort of questioning the whole validity of vaccines and whether they mattered. But before COVID struck, this had begun to change because of the things I pointed out. You had things like measles and that sort of thing coming back, which hadn't been a problem for some time. And all of a sudden they started becoming problems again. And the scientific community and the educational community, for one, really took this seriously and made a big effort to start to educate people all over again. Even schools and parents would get together and try to convince other parents that, hey, get your children vaccinated. So there had begun to be a change of perception and attitude even before uh, COVID came. And then when COVID came, it was really a question of, you couldn't deny that there was something. Um, it was forcing a reaction that was almost identical all over the world for identical reasons, which was to stop the spread of the disease. Everyone got a crash course in flattening the curve. Everyone got a crash course in washing your hands, covering your face. Um, and the proof of this, I think, some of us have been to malls since they reopened, and you've noticed they're not as full of people as we were afraid they were going to be. I think people have internalized a lot of these lessons and warnings, and that's when you know a change has happened, because you don't need people on top to be constantly reminding you of it. People are doing it on their own, and in many ways, this is sort of comforting.
Um, but we have a question from John Paul who's asking, did most pandemics end with a vaccine? What were the other outcomes? Some of them just
Yeah,
died.
I mean, yeah, some will for example, there was no vaccine for the great flu pandemic of 1918. Later on, there would be flu shots, which we've gotten used to, but that one just sort of burned through the world. And in fact, even up to now, they're still trying to in many ways sort of dissect it and figure out what kind of flu was it and why did it become so lethal. And scientists aren't um, too unified on the answers now. I mean, even the most recent scholarship has now shifted where it originated from, um, Europe to China, and then they're tracing how it spread because of ships and that sort of thing. I mean, we forget, for example, that China sent hundreds, if not thousands, of railway workers to France to fight in World War I, and they were building railways. So if you read these books about that have come out in the past few years about the great flu pandemic of 1918, it's these amazing connections. China, which is trying to prove that it's a modern country, contributes to the Allied powers. Well, there's your connection. There's a whole bunch of people traveling to Europe at the end of the war and so on. So yes, in many cases, they will burn out either because the disease just kills everyone who's who's susceptible and then can't spread anymore, or there will be cases. So, for example, a great case would be the invention of the discovery of the polio vaccine in the 1950s, and up to the 1970s when I was in school, I still had classmates who had withered legs from polio, but you don't see that anymore. And yet it was only in the past few years that we suddenly had a polio case again after over a decade of there being zero polio. So it's a combination of those.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question, and this is from JV Fino. Was there any change in work patterns after previous pandemics? I guess because everybody's adopting the work from home option now.
No, very frankly, yeah. Very frankly, I think this is what still has to be explored. Like I was looking at these books that I've mentioned and cited during our talk tonight. If there was this devastation caused by the pandemic of 1918, why isn't it sort of in our popular memory? Why isn't it? You can't sort of point to any particular words or habits that emerged from this. And even more surprising was when you discovered that there was that Hong Kong flu in the 60s and the Asian flu in the 50s. Why don't we have sort of a memory of this? Why don't you recall your parents or grandparents warning you of the flu because they remembered it in the 50s and the 60s? And part of it, I guess, is the reminder that the ability of the human species to forget once it's survived is amazing. And that's sort of what we have to fight against. It's because of scholars who, even when there is no public interest, still dig and plow through the archives, that you had books waiting in a sense to be discovered about things like the flu pandemic or the flu in general. So that when it's suddenly relevant now, we have something to refer to, and someone doesn't have to write it now when we needed it. But that's a great question, and the reality is, particularly in our society, I've always argued one fundamental weakness of Filipinos in the private and public sector is we don't do postmortems. We don't go through an experience and then get everyone together and say, what did we learn? And write it in a manual so that if something similar comes up, we don't have to rediscover everything from scratch. We don't do that. And until we learn to do that, we will always be caught by surprise and have to learn things in a hurry when something new takes place.
Of course, it doesn't just apply to pandemics, right?
Yeah, that's true.
Well, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon, everyone. And thank you so much, Manolo, for that wonderful talk. We'll have the video available on YouTube, I think in a couple of days. It should be up in the next 24 to 36 hours. And we hope to see you next week. We have a webinar on art and what next for art, especially in the Philippine context. So we'll have curators, gallerists, artists, and educators as well. So thanks, and hope to see you again next week. Thank you again, Manolo, and we'll see you again soon. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for joining us. Bye.
Bye.